Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to those of you who are back. Welcome here for those of you who are here for the first time. Let's see, is this light working? No, I'll be reading in the dark. If I say anything untoward, I'll blame it on the lack of light. All right, so last time when we were here, we talked about abiogenesis, ideas about how life could have arisen from nothing but chemistry and biology and physics. And I think we had a pretty good story to tell about that last time. We're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to talk about evolution, the theory of evolution by natural selection today. For some people, it's a fairly controversial topic. I'm going to go into some examples of why it shouldn't be controversial, although I suspect that most everyone in here doesn't think it's controversial, that it is in fact a fact. And that's what science tells us, that's the way the world works, and it is a fact. But hopefully I'll offer some corroborating evidence for that today, as well as talk through a couple of examples of some of the common arguments against the theory of evolution by natural selection and address how some of those arguments might possibly be overcome. I want to remind you, it takes a little bit of effort, and effort turns into money in most cases. It takes a little bit of money to keep the lights on here. We have an offering bowl back there. If anyone feels like contributing, you're welcome to. And also, we are part of the Humanists of West Suburban Chicagoland. We have several different kinds of meetings throughout the month, and our typical meetings are on the second Wednesday of the month and the second Friday of the month. We've got a Just Views film showing. Check us out. The best way to find out what's current about our group is to go to meetup.com and look for Humanists of West Suburban Chicagoland. And with that, we also have a YouTube channel. This is being filmed today. It will be put on YouTube. If we get to the point of asking questions and you don't want your question to be on YouTube, then hold it until afterwards. All right, natural selection. This is one of the best representations of natural selection that I have come across in the past few years. The idea is, how did we get here? It's a question that has perplexed no fewer than 100 billion human beings whose generations have come and gone well before our own. Last time we talked about the incredible juxtaposition of geology, physics, and chemistry that plausibly gave rise to self-catalyzing metabolic reactions. We talked about how those reactions turned into cycles that were more efficient, that made better use of natural proton gradients, catalyzed and replicated more of their own kind. Those kinds of molecules then migrated outside their microporous geologic structures inside of self-assembling lipid spheres. And the molecules inside kept right on pumping protons and reducing carbon dioxide. There were, in short, metabolic cells that were instantiated on Earth. Their kind is long gone from the biosphere of Earth, having eons ago been supplanted by ever more efficient metabolic factories that eventually mutated into more competent forms, including forms to harness the energy of sunlight and to eat one another. All of this science is almost unimaginably complex. I used to think that physics was hard. Last year, most of the topics that I covered were about physics. And this year, as I've been digging a little more deeply into biology and biochemistry, just the level of complexity of the subject is so vast that I cannot imagine any single human being's mind encompassing the field. The complexity of metabolic interactions, the complexity of the machinations of a single cell are so awesome that the variety of structures and processes in life are almost like magic. And in fact, Arthur C. Clarke, a famous science fiction author, He has some sort of heuristic rules about the way science works, etc. And one of his rules was that any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. So it's no surprise that as complex and awesome as the science behind life tends to be, that for 100 billion or more human ancestors, we considered that it was purely magical that life existed. For simpler processes like the sun seeming to move across our skies, that kind of process was also considered magic until physical processes that underlie the machinations of stars were discovered. Similarly, for biology, it is a vastly more complex subject than the paths of stars under the influence of gravity, but it is no less a sum and an example of natural law. But our ancestors, they had no explanation of how all this got started and how it came to be the way it is. So let's talk about that. Here's a brief representation of the history of life on Earth. Now, you'll notice down at the bottom in the Precambrian era, I don't know if you can read those dates, but it starts 3,500 million years ago. I'm not a young earther. Starts 3,500 million years ago, and we believe that somewhere around there, and this is a belief because the things that first arose as living forms on this planet didn't leave fossils. But we believe somewhere around that time, life got instantiated on our planet, corresponding to the mechanism, perhaps like I talked about last time. And then, starting about 540 million years ago, complex life began to arise. And even this diagram doesn't go all the way back to the beginning. Those earliest living things were so frail and so closely related to natural chemical processes that they left little to no unambiguous record. Life probably started about 3.8 billion years ago, understanding that the solar system formed about 4.5 billion years ago. So there are eras represented on here like the Paleozoic. Paleo means ancient, like Paleolithic is ancient stone for ancient Stone Age. So Paleozoic is ancient life. Mesozoic, medium life. And then Cenozoic. I don't know of any other words that use ceno for current, but that means current, essentially. Here's another view of the top sections of that prior graph with ever finer gradations. You may have heard of some of these terms. I think the Pennsylvanian, the Devonian, the Silurian, etc. Some of those words are wonderful to say. Ordovician, etc. And then everybody's favorite, the Jurassic era. Oh, I've got jokes, by the way. So here's the first one. What do you call a really old fur coat?
Flea-bitten.
Excellent, excellent. A Jurassic parka. So where did these names come from? They came from typically the towns or the regions around which fossils representing these geologic and biological eras of history were first found. Too bad we don't have an Auroran, huh? Or a Napervillian. Remember that life is a continuity across nearly 4,000 million years. It doesn't begin at conception. It begins billions of years before any modern conception of any given organism. It started with a messy tangle of information and chemistry swapping primitive metabolic molecules that blur the line between living and non-living. As you might expect, it couldn't be any other way and still make scientific sense. If you look at the names around the outer rim of this more recent view of the history of life, you'll see things like archaeoplastidia, which are algae. I don't know why they don't call them algae. Physics at least uses things like proton and electron and meson. We don't have many 15-syllable words. Let's see, the metazoa, which are around the top left of the diagram, that's the large animals, meta, medium size. Those are things like us, including chordata, things with backbones, etc. And then I've still got this tangle represented down there on the lower right. And the reason I've superimposed that tangle is because when you start talking about things like archaea and bacteria, as we discussed last time, they are still actively engaged in swapping pieces of their genomes back and forth. There's nothing clean and linear about the way that inheritance and cellular fission and other activities that give rise to new copies of life. There's nothing neat and clean about the way it happens for the smallest forms of life. Here's another view of the tree of life, and it zooms in on the part that we tend to be most interested in, and that's the metazoan, or the animal part. Pardon me. Of course, people, or a lot of people, especially those who aren't particularly well educated about science, have rather a row about this particular branch. We'll talk about some of the arguments that they've presented in a little while. A curious and fun little aside, here's the weight of all living things. I did this because graphs are fun. I hope you enjoy them as well. So we've got humans down on the lower left. That's the bar. That's the mass of all the humans on Earth. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. That had a question. And then there's whales. And then the third little blip there is the weight of sheep and goats. And then chickens. Then we've got ants and termites. The weight of all the fish on the planet. Krill. I don't know about the krill thing. It's probably okay. And then whales. Whales are big, but there aren't very many of them. And then cyanobacteria. So this is the mass in millions of tons of various things on Earth. And then if you add all of that mass together, it's that little tiny blip that says everything else. And most of the mass of life on Earth are the prokaryotes, the single-celled bacteria and archaea. So they were here first, they got a big head start, and they continue to dominate. Oh, and by the way, what fraction of the mass of Earth, if you added up all the living things, what fraction of the mass of Earth would life be? It's something like 9 or 10 zeros and then a 8.00, etc. So life is very important to us, but from a geologic and geochemical processes standpoint, it's kind of a little patina on Earth. Another great benefit of the little things, the prokaryotes, is the vast diversity in their metabolism. In fact, the metabolism of prokaryotic organisms make them rock stars of life. They can metabolize nearly anything. Speaking of rock stars, I had to throw up a picture of my favorite band. This is Rush. Anybody who doesn't know Rush, I recommend that you fall in love with them. Evolution of structure. So we talked a moment ago about how the little guys and gals, they don't really have genders at that level. The smallest creatures are rock stars when it comes to metabolism. Once we develop eukaryotic life, and we talked about that last time, I'm not going to recapitulate it, but evolution of metabolism was accompanied by some awesome innovations pertaining to structure, still on the microscopic scale. As Nick Lane, the author of the book that I largely drew from last month's talk, from London College and colleagues have argued the single most significant event leading out of the single-celled living legacy of Earth was the endosymbiosis of mitochondria. And actually, the person who came up with this notion that there could be endosymbiotic events was Lynn Margulis, one of the people who Carl Sagan was married to for a while. And she was very prominent in biology, and she came up with this idea that one microscopic creature could enter into a symbiotic relationship with another where one was actually completely inside the other. And we believe that eukaryotic cells, as we talked about last time, occurred when a bacteria was engulfed by an archaea. So this is more analogous to lateral gene transfer, where whole pieces of life or life's information are transferred by mutation, or transferred from one organism to another. It's more analogous to that than it is to mutation in terms of evolutionary mechanism. But the implications of internalizing a spectacularly good battery, which is the mitochondria in our cells, as a proton pump, if you'll recall, was and continues to be of titanic import. And then about 540, 600 million years ago, the first multicellular organisms arose from collections of eukaryotic cells. And that geologic period is called the Ediacaran. We talked a little bit about that. I think Mike might have talked a little bit about that in one of his talks a couple years ago or last year.
Cambrian explosion.
Yeah, and then before that, the Ediacaran, where there were just gelatinous life forms, essentially. Well, the bad thing about having a life form that's like Jell-O is that it doesn't leave much record. So there aren't very many fossil remains of the things in this picture. They were like jellyfish in some ways. And one of the ways to think about the arrival of complex multicelled organisms on our planet is to imagine all of the history of Earth as being along your arm. And if you do that, the arrival of complex multicellular life happens about here once life gets started. Life gets started somewhere around here, and then multicellular life happens here. And in this time scale, the history of humanity on this planet would be a nail filing off the end of your fingernail. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the early challenges to the idea of natural selection. Actually, this guy's argument is fairly famous. This is William Paley. The book in which he specified this argument, you may have heard of it, he was British. If I'm walking along and suddenly I found a pocket watch laying on the sand, what are the chances that that pocket watch just spontaneously happened? So I'm trying to give him a nice professional demeanor. So the chances of that happening spontaneously are arguably zero, right? Natural processes would not extrude brass from ocean waters and put them together as gears and cogs and paint and Roman numerals and launch it up onto a beach. So one of the things about William Paley is that his notion and his argument came about 50 years before Darwin published his book about the theory of natural selection. So Paley wasn't necessarily a dummy. He wasn't lacking conviction and lacking critical thinking skills to understand the science. The science hadn't been invented yet. But people have grabbed William Paley's argument and propelled it hundreds of years into the future, beyond which it had a useful lifespan. William Paley's argument was essentially a teleological argument. Teleology comes from a Greek word, meaning design, teleos, or telos, meaning design. So a teleological argument is an an argument that supposes that design must be implicated. And that's the great ancestor of intelligent design that we still see bandied about today. The notion, what is the chance that random processes made a pocket watch? Another modern take on this is, what if a tornado tore through a junkyard and suddenly out the other side you had a jumbo jet? Some people use that as an analogy for how improbable the random evolution of life is. Well, let me talk a little bit about that notion of randomness. Given a constant energy flow and an array of physical and chemical potentialities that may be limited or incalculably varied, discrete and dynamically interacting subsystems often arise. Things like this. Oh, that's the jumbo jet. Things like this. A hurricane. These subsystems are generated only from physical and chemical laws, and they form organized systems that accelerate the tendency of the broader system, of which they are a small part, to dissipate the free energy and increase entropy. They also form what we call complex and organized entities. We talked about this last time as an explanation for the origin of life from geology and chemistry. In any case, once such a system arises in a context where chemical reactions allow for great variety and self-replication, purely environmental factors will sort out those population members that are the most efficient at using energy and material and that are the most prolific. The essential difference between these replicating and metabolizing subsystems, or living organisms, and a pocket watch or an airplane is that life arises from simple beginnings and changes slowly through time to suit its often significantly changing but mind-blowingly complex environment, while keeping many vestiges of its past form and function. I told you last time that every metabolic cell in our bodies that contains a mitochondria has, as part of the active molecular structure for that proton exchange, a little tiny piece of fool's gold, iron sulfide. So the enzyme that drives metabolic processes to this day still retains, in some sense, a geologic vestige of a plausible mechanism that could explain the arising of metabolic processes from purely chemical origins. Pocket watches and airplanes are built from the top down with a purpose in mind. By an external maker, life develops naturally from the bottom up in response to environmental factors that support or inhibit replication and propagation of entire organisms and of particular features of those organisms, features that improve an organism's compatibility with and competency within those complex environments, step by step, generation by generation. As Carl Sagan said in his Cosmos television show, these are some of the things that hydrogen atoms do given a few billion years. There is no controversy to teach. This is the way the world works, and it is as much a fact as gravity. Talking about randomness for a moment, if I were to drop a ball, what are the chances that it will fall? Nearly 100%, if not 100%. We know of no exceptions to that where there's not some external force acting. But if I try to predict exactly where it'll land after rolling a bit, I don't have much chance. But if I drop a ball in a box that constrains it, what are the chances that it's going to land in the box? Well, of course, they're very high. Well, life's chemistry is kind of like that, and life's evolutionary attributes are kind of like that. They naturally acquire certain characteristics because they are fitted to the environment in which that particular organism finds itself. And if it's not fitted, it dies. It doesn't reproduce. So only those organisms that are fitted survive, and that's the survival of the fittest. Let me go back. So I want to talk about a couple of notions from geology, uniformitarianism versus catastrophism. So if you look here, I suspect this is somewhere in the American Southwest, and you look carefully at the sandstone or the mudstone layers that have been laid down, well, you can't even talk about them without speaking about the layers. And that layering process, each of those layers of mudstone or sandstone may correspond to a season of flooding and dryness, or maybe some larger epoch of wet and dry, where you've got a shallow lake that evaporates after a few years and leaves some silty deposits, etc. But the idea here is that there are gradual processes that build up the stuff on our planet year after year. They tear down mountains and leave behind sediments in low-lying areas, or especially in bodies of water. And one of the views that has been promulgated with regards to evolution is that the generation of organisms also follows this very gradual tendency. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. But there's an alternative view called catastrophism, where something like a flood would race through this landscape and carve these furrows and valleys that allow us to see these layers of mudstone. Catastrophe can make sudden change in an environment, and there are no more sudden changes than something like this. This kind of event likely happened a couple of times, at least, in the history of life on our planet, or the prehistory of life on our planet. Most of you by now have heard about the idea from the 1980s that still holds a lot of credibility, that an asteroid impact or a meteor impact in the peninsula of Mexico likely caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. Well, it's a kind of creative destruction as far as life and living things are concerned. So here's, these are some of my favorite little forms of life. So when I was a kid, I used to go out hunting fossils. And I didn't know much about geology, but I was looking in the wrong place. I was wanting to find some trilobites. Well, it turns out that trilobites are at different places in Illinois. And for the very first time, a few years ago, I found my first trilobite. I found this while I was attending an astronomy party. So while everybody else was looking up and was distracted by the stars, I found a trilobite fossil. And you're welcome to come up and look at this after the talk. But trilobites are amazing, and they have a lot of variation within the species itself. And they started being around about 521 million years ago, and they lasted for about 270 million years. So other than cockroaches, they're one of the most persistently successful organisms on Earth. And they lived in a wonderful, boring, and stable environment of shallow, warm seas, until some kind of great catastrophe got rid of them. And after that, life bounced back, and we got the first creatures that were about the size of pigs today. They were related, their descendants became dinosaurs and mammals, but they were almost completely wiped out during the Permian mass extinction. And you see that lava in the background. It's believed that the Permian mass extinction caused the death of about 96% of all marine animals, 70% of terrestrial vertebrates, and many of the insect species on Earth. This pig-sized therocephalin almost went extinct. One surviving branch became dinosaurs 50 million years later, and another branch of small related creatures gradually evolved into mammals. And what do we have to thank for this bottleneck event that inspired new kinds of life to arise after aeons of nothing but pigs and trilobites? We have Russia to thank. So there's this thing in Siberia called the Siberian traps. This was a millions of years long continuous volcanic eruption. And it polluted the atmosphere, among other things. Russia, this area of Russia, still has some of the richest mineral deposits on Earth. And so there are some benefits that accrue from volcanism, but it nearly wiped out all the life on Earth when this giant volcanic field started and commenced and continued erupting. And after the Siberian traps had cooled down, it took between 6 and 30 million years for life to recover. And life was a lot scarcer during that geologic era. In fact, we see that in the fossil record. There's gaps in geologic strata. You know, one of the rules of geology is that older things are down deeper unless something has folded the strata. Well, older fossils are also found down deeper. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple of ideas in evolution that often people misconstrue. What's the goal of evolution? There is no goal, no pinnacle, no purposeful path that leads to human beings or any other creature. Goal implies intention, and intention implies prediction merged with desire. And of course, natural laws have none of these anthropomorphic capacities. Evolution does not predict or desire, just as a raindrop rolling down a mountain finds other drops, which collectively become a stream and then a river. The path of evolution is guided by natural forces that act in the moment, factors that favor survival and reproduction right now. And if this environment changes, then consequently the paths to success may suddenly change, rewarding diversity and evolving away from the ways and forms of your ancestors, like an earthquake can change the course of a river. The form and function of species must adapt to a changing world. And then there's the notion of complexity. When you're the only microbe in the ocean and you eat CO2, the world is your oyster. Unless, of course, you are the oyster and you eat the thing that eats the CO2. Or if you're an otter that eats the oyster, or the shark that eats the otter that ate the oyster that eats the microbe. Or the killer whale that eats the shark. You get the idea. And so on in great interconnected webs, or a maze of competing, cooperating, and sometimes even non-interacting life forms, such as the fact that gorillas don't interact with stingrays. It might be helpful to think of a maze. I have to admit something to you. I guess I don't have to, but I try to be honest. When I solve a maze, I usually do it backwards. You see those little mazes that you get in magazines and whatnot? I see some heads. Oh gosh, it's so good to know I'm not the only one. Yeah. And I start at the single exit, and then I trace my way back to the start. That kind of flipped around maze with some added characteristics can be a good analogy for evolution. From one starting point, there are many paths that lead to an exit. That's assuming that there are several different paths that lead to a solution. But there are still many dead ends. Also, as with nearly any maze, many evolutionary paths lead to dead ends, to species extinction. But somewhere back, somewhere earlier in the maze, there was a branch in the path taken, or a path not taken. And that branch leads to other branching pathways. And if you trace them back, you'll eventually find that all the successful pathways end at that single origin, which is the exit in a flipped around maze. The maze also exhibits complexity. For evolution, complexity is a natural result of specialization and competition. Specialization for particular environments, often environments populated by other organisms that seek out and compete for many of the same things you need to live. Or perhaps just competition for a mate. Even a tiny improvement can make a world of difference. There are great rewards for being able to reach a little higher than the competition, to dig a little faster, to make a living in entirely new places from food sources that don't fight back as effectively. There are benefits to being able to swim a little more efficiently through some of the oceans or hide in the grass just a little better. And for every problem, there are many solutions, a practically innumerable number of ways to combine an adaptive solution and the environment. From camouflage to concealment to many thousands of other ways of being just a bit better suited to a particular environment, each successive adaptation slightly increases the chances that your offspring also will thrive. These pictures I found this past week. They're from the first annual Comedy Wildlife Photography Awards. I don't know that I can legally reproduce them, but I at least give credit to that website that has them. For every problem, there are many solutions, a practically innumerable number of ways. I already said that. From camouflage to concealment to many thousands of other ways of being just a little bit better. So, another joke. Why did the ram fall off the cliff?
I don't know. Why?
Thank you. He saw the U-turn. Or he didn't see the U-turn. So let's talk about variation within a species. This is often deemed microevolution by people who draw a distinction between micro and macroevolution. What is a species? Well, one of the classic definitions of a species are those organisms that can interbreed and produce viable offspring. There are other ways of showing the relationships and kinships between different populations of animals. You can use genetic analysis to show the relatedness of individual species or even individuals within a given species. As with many topics in biology, it is very hard to draw clear lines. DNA analysis also shows how closely related two families of organisms are, and we'll talk more about that later, especially next month when we talk more about genetics. And this was something that was interesting to me. So all of these things up here, you've got kale and Brussels sprouts and cauliflower and cabbage and broccoli and something called a broccoliflower. Interesting fact, this is all the same species, just like the dogs on the prior picture. These are different cultivars of the same species that through artificial selection, just as we have done with dogs, we have selected for particular characteristics from a root species or base species. Collard greens are also in that same family. So I want to talk about something called convergent evolution. You see at the first dolphin-looking thing, not the actual dolphin thing, is a ichthyosaur. It's an extinct reptilian or saurian, like dinosaur, creature that lived in the oceans, and it looked a lot like a dolphin. And then a dolphin is a mammal, so we've got a reptilian creature and a mammalian creature, and then we've got a shark, which is kind of a fishy creature, and they all have very similar morphologies. They have evolved similar capacities by virtue of their physical shape for dealing with a common environment. Another example of that is the eye. You'll often hear people that are not convinced that evolution is science say things like, well, how could you get an eye? And there's all kinds of explanations that you can find about that, from a photosensitive spot in a single cell organism to a mottled patch of photoreceptors on some ocean-going animals, to little pits that don't have a lens that still help distinguish light from dark and danger from safety, all the way to the development of a coating that protects that pit that eventually could become a lens. And we still have extant today on the planet Earth different examples of these creatures that show how something like an eye can have many intermediate forms. In fact, the eye has been selected for in evolution 50 to 100 times. It has arisen independently as a structure for focusing visible light many times. The key lesson of these ichthyosaurs and dolphins and eyes is that there are many, many ways for evolved characteristics to better optimize an organism and its descendants to overcome or exploit a given ecologically relevant challenge or opportunity. Some of these challenges are also tied to basic physics, such as fluid dynamics or the refraction of light. And any evolved trait that tends toward optimization of survival in a context where the physical process is relevant will exhibit clear similarities in the solution. Convergent evolution and macroevolution, which is the accumulation of microevolutionary features over huge amounts of time, is a difference in quantity, not a difference in kind. So here's Charles. He's the amazing, ingenious person who first synthesized a lot of the evidence and was compelled by that evidence to posit the theory of natural selection by means of evolution, or vice versa. And he had some questions that he considered unsolvable in his time. One of them was this notion of the young Earth. So Lord Kelvin, who lived at the same time as Darwin, was the most prominent and noteworthy physicist at the time. And he used thermodynamics and the rate of cooling of different substances to show empirically and unarguably, given current knowledge or contemporary knowledge of science, that the Earth had to be just a few tens of millions of years old, as was the Sun. But they didn't know about radioactivity. They didn't know about radioactive fusion. They didn't know that the Sun could survive and sustain its life-giving radiative powers for billions of years. So in a sense, Charles Darwin predicted nuclear fusion in a roundabout way. Because he said in order for all these changes in the organisms of life to have accrued and occurred, they must have had vast amounts of time, far more than 10 million or 20 million years. But he didn't know the solution to that. He just thought that the evidence pointed to an older Earth than anyone thought possible. He also didn't know about some missing fossils. You've heard of missing links? We'll talk about that in a moment. And then the mechanism for inheritance. How is it that a trait is passed from generation to generation? And then the mechanism for gradual change. Assuming that you do inherit some characteristic, what causes it to change? So this is the Archaeopteryx. I think this was found in Germany. I'm not sure, going by memory there. And speaking of transitional fossils, this is in many ways a dinosaur-like skeleton. It's got teeth and whatnot. It also has feathers and wings. You can clearly see the imprints of feathers there. It is believed, after simulations that were developed representing this organism and its aerodynamics, that it glided from tree to tree. It didn't really flap its wings. It didn't produce lift on its own. But you can see how this could be a transitional organism between things that walked on the ground and things that flew in the air. In fact, feathers are thought to have been attribute of many different dinosaurs. They weren't used for flight, they were used for insulation. This is a fossil known as Ida. It's 47 million year old, the first primate. It's got some interesting things going on, like an opposable digit. And it's actually got nails on the end of its digits rather than claws. It's the earliest known primate fossil. This was just announced this past week, October 2015. I'm going to butcher this name. Spinolestes xenotharsis. 125 million years old. This is your grandma. It was contemporaneous with dinosaurs. Its lineage survived, and some descendants became us. So just like with geology, this notion that you can have a sudden change or a gradual change is relevant to biology. And some people have characterized this debate in both geology and biology as a war between the creeps and the jerks. I hope it's Halloween, so I felt okay having an evil clown up and my Halloween shirt. You see that? So in biology, it's uniformitarianism versus punctuated equilibrium. Well, one of the things that they've found is that isolation helps. A study just published, again within the past couple of months, shows that after a sudden change, then having a long period of relative stability actually helps inspire the evolution of new traits in a population. And that makes sense, right? Sudden change followed by sudden change followed by sudden change. You're going to get rid of everybody. There's going to be no time to adapt. And there's also different ways of being successful with regards to evolution. There's generalization, being good at everything, like a cockroach, or specialization, like a panda, which lives on only one kind of food in one habitat. Both of them are strategies that living things have adapted. Now, speaking of creeps versus jerks, the thing up top there is a blobfish. It lives off the deep waters of Australia and New Zealand. When you take it out of the deep ocean and put it on deck, it kind of collapses into that strange human face-like thing. But why, if you have blob-like life that looks like that, it makes sense that the fossils would be rare. And they talk about missing links a lot. You know, what's the thing that led from a blob to this strapping fellow down here in the bottom right? You know, I don't know, maybe evolution went through this guy. But this is a mischaracterization. So when somebody says, are you descended from this monkey? Well, no, because this monkey is alive at the same time I am. So the monkey and I are descended from some common ancestor. So we have millions of chimpanzees. We have billions of human beings. Some people say, well, where are the millions of the Australopithecus and the millions of the Cro-Magnon and the millions of all these other supposedly intermediate species? Why aren't they around? Well, this turns the whole argument on its head, right? Both the chimpanzee and the human being are evolved from common ancestors, and the common ancestor between a human being and a chimpanzee was before any of these people. So I'd like to take a minute. You don't mind if I go over time, get closer to 11 o'clock, do you? No? Okay. So I'd like to do an interactive audience demo. I'm going to be picking people. So Beth, will you please come up? All right. And Jean, will you mind coming up? All right, which of you is taller? Beth, I think you're taller by a little bit. Okay. And then, Gary, would you mind coming up?
One of these things is not like the others.
All right. Now, I have this scientific hypothesis. My hypothesis is that human beings come in all manner of heights. And to show you evidence of this hypothesis, I yield this data. Well, my data shows that human beings only come in 3 heights. Right? So, well, let me just get right in here. Now I'm the missing link. Right? Well, how often can we do that? We can keep inserting missing links an arbitrarily large number of times. And we will never call it complete, because we won't have a microscopically, infinitesimally noticeable graduation of heights until we have billions of examples. And we're not likely to be able to collect enough data to do that. The same thing applies to evolution. There are no such things as missing links. They're just fossils that are hard to find. All right? Thank you very much.
You're a natural lad.
So debunkers don't understand evolution. They are ignorant of it. Willful ignorance is terrible when combined with anti-factual assertions on the topic in question, like pretending the moon is made of cheese. Yeah, we have bits and pieces of it. It's not made of cheese. Denying evolution is like saying, well, not just saying, but insisting to anybody who will listen that our planet is orbited by lunar Limburger. People who promulgate such balderdash show an interest in the topic, which is good, and a desire to share their understanding of it with others, which, in a different context, would be wonderful. Yet, should we not hold in infinitely higher esteem those who bother to learn the best science has to offer about a topic and share that? Those who bypass wisdom, who willfully ignore mountains of compelling and consistent evidence, warrant naught but derision. With their made-up fairy tales, they are guilty of bending, supplanting, or ignoring not just the fact of natural selection, but history, biology, chemistry, geology, paleontology, astronomy, nuclear physics, radioactive dating, genetics, biochemistry, comparative anatomy, and damn near every other kind of science. They replace a cogent and intricate description of reality, a description as deep and as vast as any ocean, with a witch's brew of pseudo-scientific language and a literal reliance on magic. This bubbling cauldron of poisonous reasoning and make-believe explanations can beguile us with its simplicity and emotional allure and mislead the naive and the uneducated. It's hard work to explain the subtleties of evolution, to instill in the human mind an appreciation for deep time, for natural selection, for inheritance and suitability, and all the ancillary ideas and evidence that supports this fact about the heritage we share with every other living being on the planet. But it's worth it. It's worth it to know what is real and factual. It's worth it to apprehend the awesome depths of nature's intricate, interrelated machinations. It's worth it to replace make-believe simplicity with an ever-expanding appreciation of the surprising. And it's worth it because it helps us to understand our place in and as a part of the world. We've talked about many of these things so far, but there are 2 more big questions we must address: the source of inheritance and the reason for gradual morphological and/or metabolic change. It turns out the solution to both of these issues has a common source. So mutation and the evolution of new characteristics relies largely on 2 concepts: resiliency and redundancy. So if you want to survive and you want to thrive, it's good to have redundancy. It's good to have 2 arms. It's good to have multiple metabolic pathways. It's good to be able to digest both kale and broccoli and fish. So this kind of resiliency to having varied capabilities, or redundancy where you've got multiple ways of accomplishing a similar end, those things are the seeds or the germs of natural selection. Natural selection can preserve innovations, but it cannot create them. That's the role of genetics and mutation. I probably don't need to tell you that DNA is the molecule within nearly every living cell that encodes genetic information. I presume most of you have heard this. Next month, we're going to talk more about genetics, epigenetics, etc. But for now, recognize that as a molecule, DNA is susceptible to change due to radioactivity in the environment or horizontal gene transfer from other living cells. Also, the process of copying DNA to form new cells, and especially the cells implicated in reproduction, is just slightly imperfect. There are errors. These imperfections also introduce change. Dr. Andreas Wagner from the University of Zurich wrote a book that's been published this year called The Arrival of the Fittest. I'll reference it at the end of the talk on a slide, but I highly recommend it. He and his collaborators have found that 60 to 80% of single nucleotide changes in a given stretch of DNA lead to little or no consequence. It's the 30% or 20% that do lead to consequence that give rise to evolutionary capability that natural selection can act upon. I mean, think about it. If you're just a little bit more tolerant for heat than other similar organisms, it's probably not going to matter until the climate gets really, really hot and our air conditionings fail. Right? So having just a little different capacity to thrive subjected to an environmental stress doesn't often become relevant until that stress becomes real in the environment. That's how organisms can be, in some sense, pre-prepared for speciation and natural selection. As for redundancy, there are often many, many copies of a given gene that encode a particular behavior. Well, if one of those copies happens to start expressing some new protein or changing an existing protein, that's going to suddenly open it up for action by natural selection to say that's either viable and good for the organism and its descendants or not. If you want, I just thought that was cute. If you want to succeed, try and try again. That's the redundancy idea. This is Thomas Edison. If something bad happens, you've got spares. Or robustness. Small changes do no harm. This is a metabolic pathway of, I believe, an E. coli bacterium. The interesting thing about this is you'll notice the color coding there. There are processes that make vitamins, which are the yellow dots, and there are processes that make lipids or fats, which are the red dots, and some other things. But what you'll notice is that there are many processes that have yellow dots and red dots at their end. There's redundancy in metabolic pathways. And this kind of redundancy means that if I introduce a particular E. coli into an environment where there's, say, more citric acid than there was in its native environment, it could eventually leverage some of these multiple redundant pathways to begin to metabolize something new or something in a newer way. This is another representation of a simple metabolic network of E. coli. You'll notice one of the things up on this slide, buried somewhere in the middle here, is pyruvate. That's that sulfur and iron thing I talked about earlier. It's at the core of many metabolic pathways. Notice the redundancy. Different colors show up at different places in the organism's network. Also notice the diversity. This particular microbe, E. coli, can eat nearly any kind of biomolecule. And this notion of networks is very relevant. So in the book that I mentioned, he gives an example, and it's been done before, of 100 different amino acids making a protein. What are the ways that you can arrange amino acids to make a protein 100 amino acid molecules long? Well, if you've got 20 different amino acids, which we do have in life on Earth, and you have 100 potential instances of these acids, and you've got the first one can be one of 20 different kinds, the second one can be one of 20 different kinds, etc. You get 20 times 20 times 20 times 20, 100 times. That's 20 to the 100th power. That's more than the number of protons in the universe. So the idea is that randomness doesn't explain natural selection, because if there was only one solution to building a viable protein 100 amino acids long, if there were one that worked, the chances of even a natural process stumbling on that one would be literally astronomical. But some of the research that has recently been done shows that for any given molecular or metabolic pathway, there are many potential solutions, just like there are many ways to evolve an eye. And I want to give you a recent example of this. There was a lot of talk this week, or last week, about perhaps awarding a Nobel Prize for the discovery of the CRISPR enzyme that is able to essentially manipulate DNA. Well, interestingly enough, just a couple weeks ago, they discovered another protein or another enzyme that does something almost identical to what CRISPR does with being able to selectively edit DNA strands. And it has no relationship to CRISPR except for its function. It's a completely different enzyme encoded in a completely different way that does a very similar function. And studies have shown that this ability to have very different pathways to the same outcome is absolutely everywhere in biochemistry and biology. There are many, 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 many ways to solve a problem, and any given mutation has a low chance of breaking the whole system. That is the fodder upon which natural selection can be built. These are two hemoglobin molecules. This is from a plant, and this is from an insect. You may ask, why does a plant have hemoglobin? There are particular plants called legumes, or beans, that are responsible for fixing nitrogen. They take nitrogen out of the air and they split it apart so that it can be used by living things. And the way that legumes do that is they've got bacteria in their roots that fix nitrogen. But that process of fixing nitrogen is poisoned by oxygen. So the plants have entered into a symbiotic relationship with those bacteria where the plants keep the oxygen away, and the way they do it is with hemoglobin. So we use hemoglobin to transport oxygen into our metabolic processes. Some plants use hemoglobin to take it away. Here are those same hemoglobins. You see that they have similar, though slightly different structures chemically. And here's a human hemoglobin. You see that there's some similarities in the human hemoglobin. It's got some other things as well. So there are multiple pathways that give rise to similar structures. Finally, last topic, social Darwinism. I think I should say at least a word or two about this. Herbert Spencer, a sociologist active in the 1940s, coined survival of the fittest. Darwin never said it. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, founded eugenics, the idea of improvement of the genetic quality of the human population. He also founded much of statistics. He was not an evil or bad guy. He also founded a lot of contemporary thought and methodology for other social sciences. Eugenics began in England and the ideas spread to the US and to Europe, where it took on horrific overtones. A purely Darwinian society would be hideously immoral, not just amoral. The institutionalization of might makes right and winner takes all. Evolution can be cruel with its mindless tendencies for outcompetition, specialization, and optimization, and parasitism. It preserves the unbroken chain of life and gives rise to innovation, propagating genes to the detriment of individuals or even whole species. Evolutionary processes give rise to horrific diseases, to a global arms race between hunter and prey, and ceaseless cycles of the new displacing the established. We must be diligent and avoid anthropomorphizing evolution, just like we shouldn't talk about balls wanting to roll downhill or energy needing to dissipate. Evolution is a natural process that occurs when imperfectly self-replicating living things give rise to progeny with variation. Progeny that must survive on an ever-changing planet while competing with million-generation removed cousins that want to live in the same place and eat the same foods while overcoming the same dangers and have more babies in the process. Fortunately, the planet, with its varied niches from hot, wet rock to bewilderingly diverse ocean habitats, from beach sands to forest fields to icy mountaintops, and even into the air above, provides ample opportunity for diversification and natural selection. But we should not artificially impose those same principles on human society, or it would be a worse world for all of us. I'd like to end with this quote. I can't add anything to it. This is from Charles Darwin. This was in his Origin of Species. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. Some of the most beautiful words ever written in science. Thank you. All right, now that I'm over that, apologize. I love science. Any questions? Comments? No? Yeah.
So the Siberian traps, is that like a super volcano? I've heard about one of the possible ways we could go extinct is a super volcano.
Yeah, the question is, was the Siberian traps like a supervolcano? So underneath Yellowstone, it's believed that there's a supervolcano that when it erupts, it's not a if, it's a when it erupts, it will essentially devastate life on the planet. That's going to be a fairly catastrophic event. The Siberian traps were a very different kind of volcanism. That was more of a slow, bubbling magma got too close to the surface and just erupted over millions of years in a slow process. The Yellowstone supervolcano, when it blows, and it is likely to be, hundreds of thousands or millions and millions of years from now, will be more catastrophic. So different process. They're both volcanoes. Other questions? Yeah.
There were a couple of recent articles on the traps, both the Deccan and the Siberians, and the relationship thereof to bolides impacting the planet. And
Yep.
it would appear that, for those of us who have been doing this a long time, there is a relationship between them. Essentially, if a bolide were to strike the planet,
Meteor.
a big rock, were to strike the planet, the force of that would be transferred around the planet and come to the other side, where it would destroy the crust.
Yep.
Actually, it's tear to pieces. And once, of course, the crust is gone, then the guts of the planet begin to spill out.
Right.
And so you've got this double whammy when something really, really big hits.
Absolutely.
And the latest one was written up in Science this past week, discussing the relationship between the impact in Mexico relative to the Deccan, the Indian
Right.
traps, and how that The combination of the two. Neither one was enough, but the combination of the two was deadly.
Right.
And so they're looking now at the Permian and saying, all right, what's directly opposite, or was
The
directly
Siberian
opposite?
traps, yeah.
And of course, there's that big hole down in Antarctica, which was fully available at the time,
Mhm.
and is now covered with lots and lots of nice, pretty ice. And so we're continuing to look in that particular area. But it would appear that, at least in those cases, the big change was not internal. It was somebody came along and sharp hit us.
Yeah, and that's one of the things about science is often hard to pin down a cause, and oftentimes people look for a cause when the causes are multiple. It's a very complex system. Other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I was in the discussion the other day, and the question came up, how old the modern human is, or should be the Homo sapiens, no?
Mhm.
Is it like 200,000 years, the oldest fossils they found of the modern human?
That sounds right to me. I'm not an expert.
That's what we kind of commonly,
Yeah.
consider about 200,000.
I think the first human, I think the divergence between great apes and humans is something like 2.5 million years ago.
It's a 7 million number.
7 million? Okay.
At least.
And then all the fossils they found of humanoids, the entire world would fit in the back of a pickup truck.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the amazing thing that they've
It's really hard to find a fossil.
Finding that.
I mean, there are probably a lot more that we haven't found because you have to dig through rock to get to them, and that tends to be kind of challenging.
The only ones you find are the ones that have a certain type of earth and soil to preserve the fossils, and
Right.
everywhere else that destroyed it.
Or where you get a place like a catastrophic flood is cut through some strata, or the Olduvai Gorge in Africa, where, because it's a gorge, you've got access to the cliff sides. Other questions, comments? All right, thank you very much. Next time, we're going to talk about genetics and epigenetics, etc. Thank you.